Hello. Yeah. Do you ever watch a tutorial? Like every time I try to learn Python or something, it all seems so slow and obvious, and then suddenly it feels like they just skip 10 steps. And I'm like, I'm lost. I really want people to get this. So I start maybe a little bit slow, so feel free to just kind of fast forward if something's really obvious. And then similarly, at the end, I just want this to be the video I can point at to explain, this part of my workflow. And so I start going through a bunch of different things that I wasn't really expecting to get into. I think I'll make little chapter markers, but yeah. Okay, first things first, because it'll kind of segue pretty well into the topic of this video too. I completely messed up my explanation of the inverse square law in the last video. I don't even know how, because, I get it. The inverse square law says that, if you double your distance from a light source, the illumination from that light source is a quarter of what it was at half the distance. And the reason for that is actually makes a lot of sense. Say you have a sphere built around a light. Here, let's put a little point light in here. And it's catching all the photons, coming off from that light. And the photons would otherwise just fly forever into space. If we double the radius of this sphere, the resulting light on the inside of the sphere is a quarter what it was. And the reason for that makes a lot of sense, because when you double the radius and the diameter, you're also doubling, the height and width. Imagine this was unwrapped here. When you scale it up by 2, you're doubling the width and you're also doubling the height. And as you probably already know, when you double the width of something, that would be twice the area. But if you're also doubling the height, you end up with 4 times the surface area. So it makes sense here if we take one of these squares here and then double the distance. It's a quarter the brightness because the same number of photons are now spread across 4 times the area. And this is great just because it demonstrates the linear nature of light. If you take an amount of light and spread it across 4 times the area, the resulting brightness will be a quarter of what it was. There, that looks a little bit more like a quarter. Because yes, this is the linearization video. I am so excited to make this video. The thing to keep in mind whenever anybody makes a workflow video is that a lot of times they're just sharing the way that works for them. I think I mentioned that I've been getting into cooking this past year, and one of the first things I did was soup. And because I didn't know anything, I was being very litigious following the recipe. And in the background, I had on YouTube other people doing soup tutorials. And everybody's advice kept canceling out everybody else's advice until the only thing in the end was you boil stuff in a broth and that's soup. So that is, I guess, the grain of salt to take this with when I say after doing CG for 30 years, this is the biggest change and the easiest, most efficient improvement to my workflow that I've seen in the past 10 years. This is a workflow where once I understood it, everything just kind of clicked into place. It's the reason I can just kind of drop footage into the Blender viewport and cut things up and mix with digital extensions and all of that, and everything just kind of plays nice with kind of minimal tweaks. And the actual process is really easy, but it does require you to kind of think about things a little bit differently. So let's use an analogy. We've got some text here. We can select all of it. We can make it a different color. We can make it, really big. We can change the font. Oh, that's nice. It's the same information underneath. It's the same words. It's just being presented and modified and transformed kind of differently. This is really handy. Say it's oh, there aren't enough, bumps here. Here we go. Editing is nice and easy. This is kind of it's a floating version of the information. And we understand that if you're trying to publish a book, at some point it's going to be words on a page. And conceptually, you can still edit it. You can still kind of cut things out and trim out paragraphs and all of that, but it's a different type of thing. Or it can be kind of destructive. If you decide, oh, these words are too big, I want to shrink them and get all those words back. You can't. It's gone. And I think this is kind of a good way to think about footage, because there is the data of your footage, the raw stuff off the camera or whatever, and then there's what your monitor can display, which is actually fairly limited. As I hope you know, your monitor is made up of pixels. Each one has a little red, green, and blue light, and they combine those different lights to form any color your monitor can display. Here we've got this right here, goes from a scale of 0 to 255. If we just have this up, only the red lights are illuminated. Purple, you get it. When all of them are on, you get white. When all of them are off, you get black. But once you get to 100%, in this case represented by 255, you can't get any brighter. Once the pixel's at 100%, that's as high as it can get. Now, mathematically, computers are great at numbers. It can definitely think of a number higher than 255 or 100%. You could tell the monitor, hey, this pixel's brightness is 1 billion. And the monitor's that's great, buddy, but I can't do anything about that. And because of that, most image formats, JPEG and all that, are designed to exist in the 0 to 255 red, green, blue ranges that your monitor can display, because that makes sense. But there are formats that can hold stuff outside of that. That's what high dynamic range images mean. In fact, if we load one up in Blender, go into the world settings, change it to environment texture, open. Let's select this one, go into rendered mode. We can look around and see our environment. It looks nice. But this isn't literally the HDRI. This is an expression of the data contained within the HDRI. If we go under the color management settings, and you can see we can actually manipulate this data. If we turn it way down, we can bring it all the way down so all we see is the sun, or we can bring it all the way up until everything's blown out, and that data is still there. It just can't be displayed by the monitor. That is the advantage of an HDRI, is it can contain more data than your monitor can actually represent. And these controls here aren't actually changing the HDRI, they're just changing how it's being presented to us. In fact, let's bring this all the way down here. I'm gonna set up a camera, and I'm gonna render this out and save it as a JPEG. File format, JPEG, the sun, great. And if I load that in as an image on a plane here, set to emissive, and I literally cannot see anything here, and that's because JPEGs are not a high dynamic range format, which means at this low exposure, there is no data there to represent. We've got to turn this exposure all the way back up before we see anything, and even then, you can see we've lost so much of our data here. Saving it to a JPEG effectively printed it out onto paper. A lot of you guys, myself included until very recently, are effectively working with JPEGs, and what I want to talk about today is how to easily instead shift your whole thing over so you're more working with high dynamic range stuff. You can see as I change the exposure in this scene, we've got all the detail here in the highlights, but if I move it up, we've still got all the detail here in the shadows, and it's all linked together with my scene. We've got all of the detail in his hair and his jacket, all of this stuff of the barnacles, but the sky's kind of blown out. If we turn down the exposure, we can see we still have all of that detail in the sky, but now we can't see the stuff in the shadows. All of the data is still there, it's just floating outside of our monitor's ability to display. And the goal is to do as much of the visual effects process as possible before we print it out. I only want to print it out to paper during the final grade, during the very last step of the process. So, let's get into it. And I'm going to start in Resolve. You can do this entirely in Blender. In fact, Nathan made some really great tools that we released here like last year specifically for doing that. But just the number of controls and things you have in Resolve, and since this is where I do all my editing and everything we're doing comes with the free version of Resolve anyways, let's just stay here. So we're in the edit panel here. I'm going to drag some footage down into the timeline. There we go. And I'm going to go down into the color panel, which is this one here with all the little colored dots. And again, most of this probably looks familiar. You've seen color wheels for shadows and highlights and all that before. But there's also a node editor here. This is the input, this is the output. Everything we do in between is, you know, the process. And from the library here, I'm going to drag in a Colorspace transform and just slip it right in line here so this turns yellow. And a Colorspace transform node lets you apply an IDT, an input device transform. The input device is whatever camera you're shooting on. And we're specifically talking about converting from log formats into linear. And you know what? I think I'm going to try to explain just everything. By the end of this video, I want you to actually understand why we're doing what we're doing and how a lot of this stuff works. Starting with, what is log footage and why does it look like this? Log is a clever way of bypassing the limitations of certain types of file formats. So like JPEGs and MP4s, they can only hold data that can be represented by your monitor. They can go from 0, they can go up to, you know, 100, which is pure white, but that's all they can store. But let's say you have a camera that can capture a wider dynamic range with a pixel value of like 200. What do? They remap it, they compress it so that any value that's 200 is remapped to 100, and anything that used to be 100 is now, you know, let's say 50. And in this way, they've effectively stored high dynamic range data inside a not high dynamic range format, with the understanding that at some point you're going to go back and re-expand it. But that's not the only thing that it's doing. The reason I keep focusing on the high dynamic range stuff is just because it's easier to wrap your head around. Either the monitor can display it or it can't, and you know it's blown out. Because another huge thing that log footage does is it expands the shadows and it compresses the highlights. What do I mean by that? Our eyes are way more sensitive to luminance shifts in darker areas. When something's bright, we're like, okay, no, we get it, it's bright. We're really more preoccupied with the dark areas for like walking around at night and stuff like that. Once we have enough light, we're not worried about it. So again, let's say we're going from like 200 down to 0. This is like direct sunlight, and down here is like maybe just dark shadows. And this stuff right here is what our eyes are really sensitive to, but most of the dynamic range is being used up in case we get, you know, a super highlight or something. So what do? They actually expand this area. They bring this shadow point up like this, and they squeeze all of this stuff, So it's just up here. And I mean that fairly literally. Like if you were trying to film this shot right here and your camera's trying to save it to log. Here, let's apply our RGB curve. It would literally just take the shadow data here and boost it up. And you can see it's compressing the highlights and expanding this shadow area. So when the file's saved to an MP4, 75% of the data is being spent on the shadows here instead of just 25. In fact, if we go back to our log footage here and put in an RGB curves and just put in some sort of curve that goes the opposite of this way, and maybe turn up the exposure, you can see it looks a lot more normalized. But obviously you can't just eyeball this. I mean, you can, but there's a specific curve that your camera uses that it applies when it's saving to log. And that curve is called the IDT, the input device transform, the input device being, you know, your camera. And if you take that curve and you apply the inverse of it to your footage, ideally you should be normalizing, linearizing, whatever it was you were actually filming and canceling out that log. So that's the luminance, but you'll notice everything is still really desaturated. And that's because it's effectively doing the same thing, but with color. Your camera can capture more colors than your monitor can represent. If you made a triangle, here's green, here's red, and here's blue. And these are the colors of the pixels on your monitor. And if we connect them into a triangle, inside this triangle is every color that your monitor can represent. This is pure red, and then if you combine, you know, red and blue, you got your, you know, magenta right here, and all of that. We call this triangle the color space. It's the space that the colors can represent. In fact, so like you've probably seen this type of diagram before. This shape represents every color that our eyes can see more or less. And this triangle overlaid on it is every color your monitor can represent. This is the like the Rec 709 or the sRGB color space that your monitor uses. And this tends to work okay. Like, it's very rare I miss anything out here. Like, man, I really wish my monitor could show, you know, super omega green. But again, computers being computers, they can conceive of a very, very bright green. And so there's different color spaces. In fact, here, let's hop into Nathan's Color Tools here. This is the triangle for sRGB here. But I can also load in the color space for my Sony's S-Gamut 3. These are the colors that it can capture. You can see it's a lot bigger. That's great. We've got all these new colors, but again, MP4s are optimized for your monitors, so they can only store things in the sRGB triangle. So what do? The exact same thing. They compress it all in there. They bring it all in and remap it. So colors that used to be super green are now just only kind of green. Colors that used to be super red are only kind of red because they're making room for any ultimate mega red colors that might still want to fit in that triangle. There's other factors too. One of the big ones is just the level of compression. You're saving to an MP4. If it's super compressed, you know, you got a little blocky compression or whatever, doesn't matter what your dynamic range is, it's still going to look really compressed. There's also bit depth, which is kind of the resolution of the colors you can represent. And you can think of it kind of like a grid over our color space here. This would be like a low res bit depth, maybe like 8-bit. Like here, okay, great, it's got a large color space, but the actual resolution of the colors it can represent within that color space are pretty low, whereas if we subdivide this a bit, maybe this is, you know, 10-bit or 12-bit. Now we've got a higher bit depth with a lot more granularity of the colors we can actually represent. And there's a little bit of strategy to this. If you're shooting on like an 8-bit camera and you can control which like color space you're recording into, and you're trying to record green screen or something on like a lower bit depth like 8-bit camera, sometimes I will pick a smaller one that actually represents what my monitor can represent, just so that the colors I'm actually using have as much resolution as possible. You can see we've got like 8 squares here, as opposed to, you know, 3. Hope I didn't lose you there. I think this is a nice visual for being able to think about, you know, bit depth and color space and kind of all of that stuff. So all that said, to properly normalize, linearize our footage, we have to know 2 things. One, the IDT, the input device transform. That is that gamma curve we apply to the footage to cancel out the log curve it was saved with. And the other one is the color space, so we can make sure that the triangle is mapped to the correct space. So this is the, you know, the IDT, the gamma, the transform, and this is the color space. And fortunately, that process is really, really easy. I'm going to hop over into Resolve now. We're going to use the Color Space Transform node. And if I drag this over here, you can see we've got this new stuff, and hopefully some of this actually kind of makes sense. We've got our input color space, we've got our input gamma, which is the IDT, which is the, you know, the luminance transform, and then we have what we want to transform it into. Now, how do you know what these are? Well, they'll be in a menu. They'll be in a menu on your camera. That's the bit you kind of have to figure out on your own. For example, on Sony cameras, you can pick your picture profile. If we go over, it shows us we're an S-Log3 and S-Gamut 3 Cine. And we can also click on that, and we can change it to whatever, but those are the settings they use, so those are the settings I'm putting in. If you've made it this far, I'm very sure that you can figure that bit out on your end. But then you just find those same options here. I'm going to do my gamma first. I filmed on Sony S-Log3, and you can see immediately we get some of that contrast back. And the color space I filmed on was Sony's S-Gamut 3 Cine. And you can see we've got some of our saturation back. And if all we were doing was color correction, we would be ready right here. We could just start doing all of our color grading. Here, pulling up the contrast, maybe turn up the saturation of those highlights. Oh yeah, that's a nice moody day. But we don't want to do that yet. Here, I'm going to delete that. We want to save our data as raw and direct and pure as we can all the way through Blender so we can do all of our color grading in the very last stage. And Resolve hates that. It wants our footage to look good for us. So it's doing all of this stuff. We're going to turn all of that off. First, the output color space in Gamma. It's transforming the footage to look good within this project. We don't care about it looking good. We want it optimized for Blender. So I'm going to change the color space to Blender's color space. By default, I might talk more about that later. sRGB, and for the output gamma, we're going straight to linear. And this actually still looks pretty good, and that's because Resolve is still messing with it. It's applying a tone map, because high dynamic range by default does not look particularly great on a limited dynamic range monitor. If we turn this tone mapping off, wow, yeah, that suddenly looks really bad. And that's because as the values of the footage exceed your monitor's ability to accurately represent them, stuff kind of starts to fall apart. Like, why does it look so cyan and saturated? Well, one example Nathan gave me that made a lot of sense. Say we have this kind of reddish orange color represented by, more red than we have green. This works fine now, but if we start to turn up the exposure on that, make those values brighter, it all works okay, but eventually the red runs out of room to keep going up. It's at 100% red value, and the only thing that can happen is the green can keep catching up. And as it catches up, you can see the entire hue of this thing shifts from being a reddish orange to just yellow. Mathematically, to the values floating outside of our monitor's ability to display it, it's still a bright orange, but to our eyeballs and on the monitor, it's the wrong color. And that's what tone mapping is. It figures out how to roll off those highlights, make everything look nice to our eyes, and show us what it thinks we're really expecting. But we don't care about it looking nice right now. Again, we only want it to be accurate. If we were to export out of Resolve with the tone mapping on, all of those bright values would export having been rolled off and kind of compressed and clipped. It'd be like right here, where it's like, oh, you can't get that other stuff back. So it'll just look bad for now, and yeah, let's export this into Blender. So in the timeline, I'm going to go to the beginning, hit I to set the in point and the out point. This will be our export range. I'm going to go to the export tab here. And if we were to export to MP4 or like JPEG or some other monitor-centric format, it would just look like this forever. All of this data would just be encoded like that. But fortunately, there are EXRs. EXRs are a format designed, I think, specifically for visual effects. They can hold the broad dynamic range, they can hold a large color space, they can even hold like multiple render passes in the same file. EXRs are pretty great. And you may have messed with EXRs in the past and found you got these huge file sizes. That doesn't have to be the case at all. In general, EXRs I found are significantly smaller than like PNGs and other similar things. You just have to make sure you have the right codec. First, we're going to change it from RGB float to RGB half. RGB float just gives us way more space for data than we're ever going to need. We don't need to be that specific. So we're just going to do half, and I'm going to use DWAA, which is optimized for animation. It is, in theory, lossy, but not like JPEG lossy. Lossy in like a way we're never going to miss it. And after choosing the right codec, the EXRs, which used to be like 60 megabytes per frame, are now like 6 megabytes per frame, which is totally great. I'm going to choose my output folder. We'll call this Rain. Great. Choose the file name, it'll also be rain. I'm going to add to the render queue and click render. Saves that out. And now, finally, although I want to reiterate, if I'm not talking the whole time, this process actually takes only like 12 seconds. Let's get into Blender. Here we are in Blender. I'm going to hit F3, import images as planes. Going to go to my footage, change the shader to emissive, select everything. And it's going to import every frame as its own file because I'm stupid. F3 images as planes. Detect image sequences. Great. Okay. Now it's a video file. And when we look at it, it's going to be purple because it actually doesn't start till frame 1. And look at that. It's right in the viewport. We can scrub around. It's nice and responsive. EXRs can play back really fast. One thing you might be noticing, all of that weird overexposed cyan garbage that was up here in the bright areas now looks okay again. What's up with that? Well, Blender also has its own tone mapper, because everything in the Blender viewport is being calculated in a linear, mathematically accurate way. And I know, the moment I say anything is mathematically accurate, a dozen of you who know color management have a knee-jerk, I must explain that it's not accurate. I know. nothing is accurate. But before you tear stuff down, you've got to build something. You can't just be saying nothing is accurate all the time, because that's why no one's going to learn this stuff. That's the promise of linear. You take the values and you multiply them by 2, and that's literally what it would be like if there was twice as much light. And that's great. That makes sense. And the moment you're like, well, if it were spectral or whatever, not yet. Not yet. Try to do a tutorial. You keep interrupting. In a linear, mathematically accurate way. But since that linear stuff looks bad on a monitor, Blender's helping us out right here under the color management tab of the rendered panel here. So I'm going to open this up, and we've got all of these settings here. None of these settings are affecting the scene itself. It's only affecting the way it's being shown to us on our monitor. We can turn on the exposure though. You can see we've got all of that data still going on in the highlights. That's great. Ooh, that looks kind of good dark. And the tone mapping itself, that thing that was right here that we turned off, in Blender, that's the view transform. Filmic is designed to roll off those highlights in kind of a nice film style way. If we change this to standard, look at that. We've got all of our ugly, nasty cyan and overexposed stuff back. And when I was learning all of this, at this point, I started getting very frustrated because everything is always changing everything. Like, why is the exposure moving? Why is everything always floating? I kept being like, what does it actually look like? What is my actual footage? And that's kind of the most frustrating part about all of the color management stuff is there is no actual just footage. Nothing actually looks like anything. It's always based off of, well, it depends, or like whatever. Even in real life, if you've ever been sitting by a window and the sunbeam is hitting one of your eyes, and then eventually your eye adapts, and so when you look around, everything in your right eye is like, dark and green, and the other eye looks, all blue or whatever. Which eye is real? None of them. Both of them. It's the way your brain is interpreting stuff. Say you've got, color blindness, or like, the cones in your eyes are more sensitive to a certain thing, and everything's skewed, and the red you see is different than the red I see, and yada yada. There is no actual absolute thing. Even when you're exporting your final video, even when you're finally, printing to the piece of paper, you've got options like, do you want a gamma 2.2 or gamma 2.4? One's optimized for if you think people are going to be watching it in a dark room. The other's optimized if you think people are going to be watching it in like a bright room. It's so powerful once you know it, but it also drives me crazy. And my only solace in all of it is that this workflow messes with the data as little as possible. I'm able to maintain the mathematical integrity of my original source footage for as long as possible until I decide that I want to apply a final look to it. So here, I'm going to add a camera, line it up with this footage plane here. It'll be off a little bit, but that's okay. I can add my, CG to it if I want to, and look at that. It's all playing nice. The values of the water are actually illuminating the cube a little bit. Isn't that great? Here, maybe we add a little bit more light coming in from the top. This isn't a real comp. I'm just, I don't know, doing a thing. And yeah, and this is ready. We can export this back to Resolve, but before we do, I want to show you a little bit more stuff. Here, let's go into the shader editor here. If I select this material and zoom in on the footage node, you can see the color space is set to linear. We could also change it, to whatever. By default, Blender assumes the EXRs are storing linear data, so it picks the right option. One thing that we've already covered is that linear is actually the gamma. That is the IDT, the luminance transform, not the color space, which is the triangle. The fact that Blender lumps the gamma under the color space I think is actually a little bit naughty, but that's okay. But yeah, if I click on this, you'll see I've got all of these options for my actual cameras. These are the IDTs to normalize the log footage straight from my things, so we don't even have to bother with Resolve. If I just import this footage directly, F3 images as planes, this is that raw footage right off my camera. If we bring it up here, stick it like that, we can change the color space to sRGB, S-Gamma Cine. And just like that, it matches our EXRs without even having to go through Resolve. And all of these are based on my exact camera and camera sensor. It's really cool. If you want to find out more about this, you can look in the Patreon for Nathan's Eat the Future Color Tools, which you guys paid for by just being here on the Patreon. Thank you for that. A lot of cool stuff in those tools, making HDRIs and making profiles for their camera and setting up an open color I/O thing to synchronize stuff all over. But I already made that tutorial, so you can just go look it up. The reason I don't use this option much is for two reasons. One, it's because usually I'm getting my footage from the edit. This is just the entire clip, and this is just a nice way to work specifically with the frame range. The other one, maybe even the bigger one, is response time. You'll notice now when I try to scrub through, it takes forever. And I go, let's look at this frame. Think. And And that's actually for a very weird technical reason. Here, I'm going to delete this footage, and you can see again, we've got all of our responsiveness back. When you have the color space set to linear or sRGB, your GPU recognizes those, and so it gives you a huge boost in processing those transforms effectively in real time, as opposed to a lot of other transforms which don't get that boost, and so everything goes slow. Nathan did crazy cool stuff. For example, just to make things complicated, if I go into the color panels here, I can change my display device to be slog3. And now it's applying that LUT transform on my entire viewport, so everything looks as if we're shooting it in S-Log, Sony's log. I can't think of why you'd ever want to do this, but it's kind of cool that you could. In fact, I'm going to leave these settings here because there's one last kind of confusing note. You remember in Resolve's Colorspace transform node, we had to turn tone mapping off, or that was going to be encoded into our data forever. Blender has a different understanding of linear data and EXRs. Again, remember all this stuff here is just a transform that's being done for our benefit. It isn't actually affecting the underlying data. And if we were to export a JPEG of this, JPEG water go, render it out, you can see it saves the JPEG with that like weird S-Log look on it. But if we export to an EXR, open EXR, gonna make sure it's RGB, we don't need the alpha channel of A. We're gonna make sure it's float half and change the codec to be DWAA. Since Blender knows that all of the transformations and math taking place in the viewport are linear, and EXR is a linear format, it ignores all of these settings here and just saves our raw linear data. Which means I don't care much about any of these settings. These are just for helping me work as I'm working in my Blender project. Like, I'll turn down the exposure and make sure everything works good, you know, when it's underexposed, maybe turn it up so I can work in the shadows. But I know that none of this is my actual image, which again, I know is a kind of a frustrating thought when you're first wrapping your head around this. And I guess that's as good a time as any to talk about AGX. AGX is a view transform, like Filmic or, you know, any of this stuff. It figures out how the colors, what the colors do when they get overexposed and the tone mapping so it looks good to your eyeballs. But it is just kind of a preview transform to make your viewport look nice as you're working in it. Once you export to EXR, it's not going to save any of that EGX stuff into it. Which is why I don't really bother with doing any of that AGX stuff. Like, it's nice, but I'm just going to lose it the moment I export out of Blender. If you have been using it and you really like the look that you get and you want to recreate that in Resolve, what you have to do is get that same AGX tone map so you can apply it in Resolve also during your final grade. I looked around and it looks like there's tutorials telling you about kind of how to do that, but I've never done it personally. And now let's finally finish our little round trip. I'm going to set up my export settings. Create a new folder, we'll call it Blender EXRs. Great, Blender EXRs. Date our frame range. And because we're just rendering out basically one still, I might turn down some of the samples here. We only need here, let's do like, 40 samples. And under denoising, we will use GPU. And here we go. All right, that's probably enough. Let's go into Resolve, go into the Edit panel here. Here's our original linearized footage. I'm gonna hit Control-I to import. Here's the Blender EXRs, Control-A, select everything. I'm gonna drag this down into the timeline here. There's our cube in there, and you can see, apart from the addition of the cube, our footage is identical. This is our source footage, and this is our footage after it went all the way through Blender. We have done it, we haven't messed with the data. This is great. Okay, so now that we've done this, what do we do? Well, let's go back into the color panel for our Blender render, and I'm going to use, you guessed it, another Colorspace transform node, but this time kind of going backward. We're going to put the Blender data into the input here, so that's sRGB and linear. Going to turn off that tone mapping, and we get to decide now what we want to turn it into. We can turn it into anything. In fact, let's turn it back into the settings from our original camera, sgamut 3 Cine, slog3. And if I go back to my timeline here and drag in that original clip, you can see my Blender render perfectly matches up with the original footage from the camera. And what's cool about this is this means if you've got a full timeline, you've been filming all of this stuff, you have a color grade you've been working on to match your camera footage, your CG stuff will just fit perfectly into that. You can pass that off to the color grader or, do it yourself, and it'll all just play nice. And just after spending, decades fiddling with stuff and always wondering, how come this doesn't match that and all of that, having linear as that reference point and having this little workflow has been really nice. If I'm doing VFX work, if I'm doing like freelance stuff and somebody sends me some footage, I'll always try to make sure I know what color profile or, type of log or whatever they were shooting on so that I can apply the correct IDT and kind of normalize everything. I can also, if they want, undo that and send it back to them in the exact format that like their footage was sent to me at the end. And also, usually just, the sensor and the focal length are useful things to know for 3D tracking. And while we're here, one thing I didn't cover in this tutorial is we're talking about log being encoded into MP4s, into formats that are not really designed to hold that high dynamic range footage. Some cameras can just do that. They can record to a format called RAW. RAW just lets you save the footage. You're not trying to cram it into anything. I've never worked with RAW myself. I know there's a lot of reasons it would make sense. I assume the process is very similar to this, where you import it and then you apply some sort of color space transform to convert it into whatever format you want it in. I'm sure there's a lot of tutorials out there. So that's basically the tutorial. I hope it made sense. I sure tried hard. There's a lot more we could talk about. Again, some of the advantages of Nathan's color tools and all of that. There is one problem with this workflow. You remember that depending on your camera, it can record a very large color space like this, but our monitors can only represent this smaller sRGB color space. And when we exported our EXRs out of Resolve, we exported them to linear sRGB color space, which means when we exported our EXRs out of Resolve, we were lobbing off all of the data out here that our monitor couldn't display. Now, I personally have never noticed that data missing. Kind of who cares? But mathematically, there are cases where you'd have a super hypersaturated color, and you might notice after doing this process that some of those colors are missing. I've never noticed, but it is possible. And really, even more than like missing specific saturated colors, it's more once you get them into Blender and you start doing operations on them, like lighting a texture with a super saturated light or something. Suddenly, when the operations are applied, you're getting results that maybe don't seem totally accurate, which is as good a time as any to talk about ACEs really fast. ACEs is, to the best of my understanding, an optional color space. Like when you're in Blender, everything you bring in the viewport and do in the viewport, any texture or video or whatever, is converted to an sRGB color space. That's what the viewport is, which makes sense for a monitor, but as we've covered, it is one of the smaller of like the color spaces. And if we wanted, it's possible to alter config files, and what the ACEs workflow does is it changes the Blender viewport to be a wider gamut color space like ACEs. That means everything you bring into the viewport, instead of being converted to sRGB, is converted to exist in that larger color space. And to clarify, I'm not just talking about one of these, color management view transforms to like change how we see the viewport. I'm talking about something that takes place inside the path tracer itself, a way of calculating the textures and all of that, which is good, but also that's not going to be this tutorial. Thank you to Zeke Faust for explaining so much of this to me too. Although I guess just to wrap things up, every time I talk about linear workflows, people bring up ACEs or AGX, and whenever they talk about that, they're usually talking about color grading, which hopefully at this point you can see is kind of a separate topic from a linear workflow, but let's touch on it just really fast. So we already explained with the color space transform node, you can convert your linear EXRs into, whatever other format. You can convert it into, the log format of your original camera, whatever you want, which means let's pick up there. I'm going to select this, go into my color tab. You can just use your color space transform, put in your settings, use the color wheels to kind of make it look however you want. But let's see, kind of like that filmic tone mapping roll-off you get in the Blender viewport, and the DaVinci tone mapping doesn't really do it for you. Resolve 19, I think this comes for free, has a film look creator. We can drop that there instead, and it'll help you kind of emulate different film stocks. If we do our color space override, you can see we can put in our same info. Maybe change the white point. And this has a bunch of great controls for trying to emulate a kind of filmy type look. They've got lots, the grain and the bloom and all that. I think there's ways to more litigiously emulate different film stocks, but this is more of a kind of artistic to taste type thing. Yeah, I like this. This feels nice and tangible. But yeah, I'm also not technically very good at color grading. I got a few tricks that kind of work okay, and I know how to nudge stuff, so I like it, but, well, that's a whole kind of other thing. But the point of this video is if I take some of my, Blender EXRs, I can copy that existing grade, and as long as I convert the color space from linear to my camera or whatever, it should all play nice with just all the other footage. And I actually like this. This feels good. I gotta go regrade this whole scene in the next 2 days now. Let's quickly do like a green screen example too. So I'm going to select my green screen clip, right click, create new timeline using selected clips. In this case, we can just use the project settings. We'll call this green screen Tom. And here's our clip. You'll notice this doesn't look quite as much like log as the other log we were looking at, and that's because this was filmed on a different camera, and different cameras have different equations, have different IDTs they use to save their log versions of their footage. Sony tends to be really flat and kind of low contrast and gray. The Blackmagic 4.6K I filmed on actually looks more like regular footage just right out of the box. But here, let's select this range. And I know I always call this Resolve, but technically it's, you know, DaVinci Resolve Studio, which contains Resolve, which is an editor, and the color tools, and also Fusion, which is a node-based compositor. It's what I've been using instead of After Effects for the past few months. And you can access that by selecting this clip and going down to the magic wand here. You can see, just like with any node editor, we've got our input and our output, and we can do stuff in the middle here. The first thing we want to do is... what is the first thing we want to do? Well, we can linearize it the same way we did in the color tools. If you select one of these nodes and hit Control Space, it'll let you insert a node after the selected node. So if I go and do this and do Colorspace Transform, it automatically sticks this in line here, and we can do exactly what we did before, input color space. Black magic makes it a little bit more confusing to figure out what color space you're in, but it's 4.6K vid gen 3, and the input gamma is this. And the color space transform in Fusion automatically directs to Rec 709 linear. Rec 709 and sRGB are basically the exact same thing color space wise. Like if I change this to sRGB, you're not going to see a difference. And still we've got our tone mapping, going to turn that off. And you can see we're back in the space where we're losing some of that highlight data when we're just viewing it on the monitor, which is good. You can see some of these highlights are overexposed. That's the stuff that, to me, once it's in the final shot, those little glints and highlights really actually help sell it. I love those little over bright bits. And I was just talking about how you can convert like a wide gamut color space into sRGB, and usually that's okay. On the chance that like something like his saturated yellow coat does seem to be kind of clipping like yellow-wise, sometimes I'll turn this on and turn on the saturation compression. You see, you can just kind of roll off those hypersaturated areas. If we keep it at 1 here, I think that means it's basically doing what the tone mapping does, but just with the saturation values. At least I'm pretty confident. Yeah, of course. Okay, so this is the linear version of our footage, and this is what we want, but we also want an alpha channel. And you'll notice when we linearize stuff, it tends to get darker because it doesn't even have the transforms that normally boost the footage up to look good on our monitor on it. So I'm going to push this up here. We'll use that later, and I'm going to create my own new version of the footage just for pulling a good key. I'm going to do that by clicking here and saying, what should we say? Let's add a color corrector node. I'm going to drag our input into the input here. And you'll notice there's 2 panels up here. There's 1 and 2. If I click on a node and then click 1, it's going to show in panel 1. And if I click up here and click 2, it's going to show number 2. And this is really nice. It means you can always kind of, it's like a preview node in Blender. It means you can always kind of see where you're at. Actually, before we do the color corrector, I'm going to slip another color space transform node in there too. If I drag it while holding down shift, it lets me just pop it in there. But instead of sRGB and linear, I'm going to change linear to gamma 2.4. That or gamma 2.2 are like the gammas that your monitors use. And we didn't really get into that, but don't worry. I mean, you could also just do this in the color corrector by like turning up the contrast and the gain and all that. All we want are good, well, that looks bad, but all we want are good green values. In fact, I might go in here and just turn up the saturation, make the green really green. Yeah, that's looking okay. So, next, let's do a little garbage matte. I'm just going to put in a chroma keyer. And with this selected, if I click and drag right here, it'll key out all of those values. We don't see anything because remember, we're previewing this one. So if I select this and hit 1, suddenly we'll see that stuff keyed out. And the big thing I'm trying to make sure of is I don't lose too much detail from the hair, because hair tends to be the hardest part to pull a key on, and often the darker parts of the green screen match the values of where dark hair is blending back into the green screen behind it. An easy way to get around that I use a lot is just to mask off the effect. Here, if we select this node here and use the mask tool, we can just kind of draw around his head. And you can see now it's only keying his hair, but with the node selected, we can check invert. And now his hair goes untouched while the effect is applied to everything outside the mask. And that's because this mask is plugged into the effects mask of our chroma keyer, which controls where this effect gets used. So that's good for the rough stuff. Let's branch this off again, and I'm going to add a delta keyer here, which is a slightly more nuanced. You can see this one's all speckly. It kind of has just like a clear threshold of when it keys things or not, which is nice and fast, but we want something a little smarter. So I'm going to drag this into the delta keyer, click 1 to preview this instead. And if I click and drag with this eyedropper over into the scene, you can see this is really nice. We're getting a lot of our hair here. In fact, if we go into the matte settings, we can change the threshold to clean up the background a little bit, pull some of our hair back, maybe clean that up a tad. And you can see where it blends into the darker parts of the green screen, we've still got some speckles. But ideally, if we combine it with this one, it'll all work. But there's also all this other stuff here. Let's fix that with a quick garbage mask. You'll notice in the delta key here, we've got all these other inputs. We've got our same, effects mask node. We've also got a garbage mat input here. So let's use that. Select this node. I'm going to hit 1 to make sure we're previewing it. I'm going to click the polygon mask tool and just drag around the stuff I want to keep here. That's looking good. I'm going to make sure, right now it's going into the effects mask again, so I'm going to drag it down into the garbage mask. And it also assumes that you are masking the garbage. And instead, I masked Tom, which is the one thing I want to keep. So again, with this selected, I'm going to check invert. And this is working okay. Actually, too okay, because I still want to demonstrate here. We'll show a little bit more of this. How to combine these two keys real fast. And we can do that with a matte control node, which helps you control the matte. Here, I'm going to just hit control space, matte control node. This is the foreground, this is the background. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to drag the output of the chroma into one and the delta keyer into the other here. If I can grab these little arrows. And when you click this, you can see it lets us decide what we want to combine and how. We want to combine the alpha channels using the minimum, which means it's always going to use whatever value is the lowest when it comes to alpha channels. And if we hit 1 to preview this, you can see now that compared to before, all this other little stuff is gone. This is great. And this is where I should point out, there are a ton of really good tutorials of absolute node wizards doing crazy high-level math and stuff to like preserve motion blurs and pull, extract hairs from nothing and just really smart stuff. Like a lot of people recommend before you do anything, you should denoise your footage before you pull a good key. All of this stuff is very smart and you should do it, but this is effectively what I do. And so definitely watch those tutorials if you need, something a little bit heavier. But my goal is usually just to get a green screen that's green enough that I don't really have to worry about learning all of that crazy node stuff because I'm not that smart. So let's just apply this mask. Well, first let's inspect it a little bit, making sure we're looking at this node. I'm going to change the view to, just by clicking here, you can pick whatever you want. Let's change it to alpha view. You can see we've got a little bit of transparency here. And there's a few things we could do here. We could just slide up clean foreground, which probably fixes things, but a lot of times can also, it'll fix the holes in the hair. You can see the hair is kind of shimmering here, so I'm going to reset that value. I could just pull down the high thresholds till that disappeared, but again, the hair tends to get a little bit too crispy when you do that. I actually generally want to keep these values as far away from each other as possible because that preserves all of this like vaguely transparent wispy stuff. But one thing you might notice is it's basically all the yellow values, and that's because for whatever reason, color keyers tend to key out yellow like they do green. Maybe mathematically the green and yellow kind of look similar to a computer. And the way I've gotten around this is kind of ridiculous, but here, let's just bring in like a hue node. And for the yellow values, I'm just going to change them to be like, I think this is like bringing it to be a little bit orange. And if we go back to full color view, this looks a lot better. Now, one thing you've noticed, and it doesn't look quite as egregious when we see it in color as compared to the alpha channel, but these little bits of tape are still kind of included. Like there's another one right here. And just for the sake of making things look nice, let's add in one more chroma key here just to fix that. Here, I'm going to pull this down. Add another chroma key here, drag this into the input, hit 1 to preview it, and we can just click and drag right here on this piece of tape. Nice. Go into the matte, blur it just a little bit, maybe like expand it, make sure it's not also like keying any of his hair. Ooh, and maybe grab this stuff too. Yeah, that looks okay. And to combine this, again, we can just use another matte control. Plug this new chroma keyer into that and make sure we're still combining the alpha to minimum. And when we look at that, it actually doesn't look that much better. We can still see it. And that's because in Fusion, you have to be a little bit more aware of the pre and post multiplication of the color values by the alpha channels. I'm not going to explain all that in this video, but basically, look, if we check this, that stuff disappears and the key looks better. A good rule of thumb is just keep this unchecked for everything until your final alpha channel operation, which in this case is going to be when we combine this this key that we got with that original linearized Colorspace node that we made. And to do that, we're just going to use another matte control, plug our linearized version into the background here, and I'm going to drag our other matte into the foreground, combine them with an alpha channel, set it to minimum. Now we check post multiply, and there we go. We've got a good key on nice linearized footage. I might go through and in between here add a spill corrector node, set it to green, and you can see that just gets rid of some of that green fringe from the transparent bits. I might tweak the gamma just a little bit to kind of tuck in some stuff. But yeah, otherwise, I think this will be great. Let's go back into the editor here, set our in point with I and our out point with O, and we can export it. Here, we're just going to check the Deliver tab down here. Let's set up our export folder. Let's create a new one. We'll call this Tom's Wonderful Key Time. File name, Tom's Wonderful Key Time. And again, we use all of these same settings, EXR, RGB half, you know, DWA, DWAB. The only difference is we're going to make sure that export alpha is checked. A weird note, if you try to change the resolution of the final export, sometimes the multiplication can be a little bit weird, but in this case, that's fine. Add to render queue, let's render it out. And it's done. And remember, like when we look here, it's still like this looks pretty garish and weirdly oversaturated and blown out. And that's why I avoided this workflow forever. But that's because we're seeing this with no tone mapping. Let's bring it into Blender. I'm going to hit F3, import images as planes. Tom's Wonderful Key Time. Make sure we're sorted by name, select everything, detect image sequences, and set it to emission here. If we go to frame 1 and take a look at it, we should have a somewhat decent key here. And yeah, this isn't bad at all, really. I work with stuff like this all the time. If you want, you know, you can go under the emission things, and this is maybe too bright, so I'd make it like 4. Yeah, he's just here in 3D. His hair detail and all those highlights are preserved, so they all kind of fall off nice. Looking at it, I can still see a little bit of this tape. In a dark environment, you actually wouldn't even notice that at all, so I would probably never fix it. But if we're feeling lazy, we could also add a gamma node here and stick it on the alpha channel and just raise it up a little. It just skews the middle point of the transparent values. You can see it kind of like eats into the hair a little bit, which isn't always what you want to do, but sometimes it's nice and handy. Here we go. And that is basically exactly how I set up this shot right here. Which looks okay. It's one of my first keys. There's probably stuff I do different. I think I probably have his exposure turned down a little bit too much. But, yes, okay, now I feel good about this. Hopefully you learned something useful or something good in there. I'm going to now edit down this 3 hours of footage and hopefully make a tutorial out of it. All right, new episode coming out in, like, I don't know, probably tomorrow by the time you see this video. I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.